My name is Marie and I am 29 years old. I never imagined I would collapse in my medical office, struggling to breathe, while my parents told my colleagues they couldn't come because my brother Jake was dealing with his gambling debts. Even after the doctor warned them that my condition was critical, they never showed up. This wasn't the first time they had chosen Jake over me, but I decided it would be the last. Let me tell you about the confrontation that changed everything. Before I begin my story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Ohio in a house that appeared stable from the outside. My parents, Robert and Linda Martinez, had 2 children. I was the older one and my brother Jake came along 4 years later. From the moment he was born, there was something different about how my parents treated us. When I was 8, I won the regional spelling bee. I rushed home with my trophy, my heart pounding with excitement to show my parents. They gave me a quick congratulations before turning their attention back to Jake, who was having a tantrum because he couldn't find his favorite toy car. I told myself it made sense. A crying child needed more immediate attention than a spelling bee trophy. By the time I was 13, I had grown used to this pattern. When I brought home perfect grades on my report card, my mother would nod with approval, but save her enthusiastic praise for Jake, who had managed to pass his math test with a C. When I was accepted into the advanced placement program, my father said he was proud, but couldn't attend the ceremony because Jake had a soccer game that same day. I became an expert at justifying their choices. They were busy. Jake was younger and needed more guidance. I was more mature and could handle things independently. I convinced myself these were all reasonable explanations for why my accomplishments seemed to fade into the background, while Jake got celebrated for the smallest improvements. What made things more complicated was my career path. At 18, I decided to pursue medical school, which meant years of intense studying and financial sacrifice. My parents seemed to view my medical studies as both a source of pride and an inconvenience. When I had to miss family gatherings to study for exams, my mother would sigh about how I was becoming too focused on work. When I needed quiet time to prepare for the MCAT, my father would complain that I was being antisocial. Jake never had any academic pressures. He was charming and outgoing, always the life of the party. He became popular in high school, and my parents never missed his social events. They would beam with pride at his football games and school dances, while I sat in the library preparing for medical school entrance exams, feeling the weight of their expectations and the loneliness of their absence. As we grew older, the disparity in how we were treated became even more pronounced. When it came time for medical school, my parents told me they could only help one of us with education costs. And since Jake wasn't book smart, they needed to save money for his future business ventures. I took out massive student loans and worked night shifts as a medical assistant to pay for my education. Meanwhile, Jake dropped out of community college after 2 semesters because he found it boring, and my parents comforted him by funding his first business idea, a food truck that failed within 6 months. Despite all of this, I held on to hope that someday my parents would recognize my sacrifices and dedication. I graduated medical school with honors, completed my residency in pathology, and secured a position at the city's main hospital. I made sure to visit home regularly, always bringing expensive gifts for everyone and going out of my way to be the perfect daughter. But no matter what I did, Jake remained the center of our family's universe. Last year, after another holiday where I felt like an outsider in my own family, I finally decided to create some distance for myself. I moved to an apartment across town, close enough to maintain contact, but far enough to establish some independence. I found a beautiful 2-bedroom place, continued excelling in my medical career, and started building a life that wasn't defined by seeking my parents' validation. Jake, now 25, still lived at home. He cycled through various get-rich-quick schemes, none lasting more than a few months. He spent most of his time at casinos, online betting sites, and borrowing money from friends. My parents continued to support him financially and emotionally, acting as if this was perfectly normal for a man in his 20s. The situation reached a breaking point when Jake developed a serious gambling addiction. Not just casual betting, but high-stakes poker games that left him owing thousands of dollars to dangerous people. Despite knowing about my demanding schedule as a pathologist, my parents not only enabled his addiction but expected me to help cover his debts. They had already spent their retirement savings bailing him out multiple times, converting their home office into Jake's recovery space, complete with expensive therapy equipment and a personal counselor. When I expressed concern about enabling his destructive behavior, my mother simply said, "You make good money now, Marie. Jake really needs our support to get through this." That was my family in a nutshell. Jake's emotional needs always trumped my professional responsibilities. His crises always outweighed my achievements. But still, they were my family, and some desperate part of me kept hoping that someday things would change. I maintained a complicated relationship with Jake despite everything. He was irresponsible and self-destructive, but I didn't believe he was intentionally malicious. He had simply grown up in an environment where he was constantly rescued and never faced real consequences for his actions. Sometimes when it was just the two of us, I could glimpse the sweet little brother I had taught to ride a bike as a child. Those moments kept me holding on, hoping that beneath the layers of addiction and dysfunction, there was still a real family connection to be saved. Looking back now, I can see I was setting myself up for heartbreak. I was clinging to a fantasy version of my family rather than accepting the reality of who they were and how they valued me. But sometimes fantasies feel safer than harsh truths, especially when those truths cut straight through your heart. I had spent 29 years trying to earn the love that should have been freely given. It would take a health crisis for me to finally understand that no amount of trying would ever be enough. 4 months ago, after several weeks of minimal contact with my family, I decided to make an effort to reconnect. I called my mother and suggested I come over for dinner that weekend. To my surprise, she seemed genuinely excited about the idea and immediately agreed. "That sounds wonderful, Marie. We haven't seen you in so long. I'll make your favorite enchiladas, and your father will pick up that flan you love from the bakery downtown." Her enthusiasm sparked a familiar hope within me. Maybe they had missed me after all. Maybe they did care. I spent the rest of the week looking forward to Saturday, even buying an expensive bottle of wine to bring along and a new dress that I thought my mother would approve of. As Saturday approached, I made sure to clear my schedule completely. I had been working long hours at the hospital lately, and I wanted to be fully present for this family dinner. I also prepared mentally, reminding myself not to expect too much, and to focus on enjoying whatever positive interactions occurred, rather than dwelling on any disappointments. When I arrived at my parents' house that evening, I was greeted by my mother's warm embrace and the delicious aroma of her homemade enchiladas. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Then I heard raised voices from inside the house and my heart sank. "Is Jake here?" I asked, already recognizing the familiar tension that accompanied his presence. "Of course Jake is here. This is his home," my mother replied, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "He's been staying here this week while he sorts out some financial issues." I hadn't even known Jake was having money problems again, which was a conversation for another time. Right now, I had a more pressing concern about the shouting coming from upstairs. "Mum, what's going on? It sounds like he's arguing with someone." My mother's expression hardened slightly. "He's just on the phone with some business associates. It's nothing serious. You worry too much about Jake. He'll be fine once dinner is ready." Before I could respond, my father appeared in the doorway, forcing a smile. "There's my successful daughter. Come on in. Dinner will be ready soon." I hesitated, then stepped inside. What choice did I have? I had driven across town for this dinner, bought wine and a new outfit, and built up expectations for a nice family evening. Leaving now would only confirm my role as the difficult daughter who couldn't handle a little family drama. Inside, the arguing continued upstairs. I could hear Jake's voice getting more agitated, using language that made me uncomfortable. My parents seemed to ignore it completely, going about their dinner preparations as if nothing was happening. I kept wondering what kind of business associates would cause such heated conversations. But I tried to focus on setting the table and helping with dinner. "The enchiladas smell amazing, Mom. You remembered all my favorite ingredients." "Of course I did," she smiled, but I noticed her glancing nervously toward the ceiling every time Jake's voice got louder. When we finally sat down to eat, Jake joined us looking disheveled and stressed. He barely acknowledged my presence before diving into his food. The conversation revolved almost entirely around Jake's various business opportunities and the unfair people who were making his life difficult. Whenever I tried to contribute to the conversation, talking about my recent research publication or the promotion I was being considered for, my parents would nod politely before quickly returning to the far more pressing topic of Jake's latest crisis. By dessert, Jake's phone was ringing constantly. He would answer each call with increasing agitation, speaking in hushed, angry tones about money and deadlines. My parents looked increasingly worried, but still focused all their attention on him. Finally, I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Jake, is everything okay? You seem really stressed." "It's just business stuff," he snapped. "Some people don't understand how investments work. They want their money back too fast." My father leaned forward with concern. "How much do you need this time, son? We can figure something out." I felt my stomach drop. "This time? How much money are we talking about?" My mother shot me a sharp look. "It's family business, Marie. Jake is going through a rough patch, and we all need to support each other." "I'm not being unsupportive," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite my growing anxiety. "I'm just trying to understand what's happening." "What's happening?" Jake said bitterly, "is that I made some investments that didn't pan out, and now some very impatient people want their money back immediately. It's not my fault the market crashed." I had a sinking feeling this wasn't about legitimate investments, but before I could ask more questions, my father spoke up. "We've already helped as much as we can. We might need to ask you to contribute something, Marie. You're doing well financially, and family is family." I stared at them in disbelief. "How much money are we talking about?" "50,000, Jake muttered, not meeting my eyes. $50,000? I nearly choked on my flan. "Jake, what kind of investments require $50,000 that you can't afford to lose?" "It's complicated," he said defensively. "You wouldn't understand. You've never taken any real risks in your life." That stung more than he could know. I had taken enormous risks, just different ones. I had risked my entire 20s on medical school, accumulating debt that I was still paying off, working grueling hours as a resident, sacrificing relationships and social opportunities to build a career that could actually support me. "I think I should go," I said, standing up from the table. "Thank you for dinner, but this conversation is getting uncomfortable." "Already? But we haven't even had coffee yet," my mother protested. "And we wanted to discuss how we can all work together to help Jake through this difficult time." "Another time," I said, gathering my purse. "I need to process what I've heard tonight." Jake rolled his eyes. "You're always so dramatic about money, Marie. It's just a temporary loan between family members. I'll pay everyone back once my next venture takes off." I didn't bother responding to that. I thanked my parents for dinner, declined their suggestions for ways I could contribute to the solution, and made my way to my car. As I drove home, I could feel my chest tightening with a familiar mixture of anger and disappointment. I stopped at a coffee shop on the way home and sat in the parking lot, trying to process what had just happened. My parents wanted me to loan Jake $50,000 for what sounded suspiciously like gambling debts, and they presented it as if it was my family obligation. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted, both emotionally from the family drama and mentally from trying to figure out how to handle this situation. I changed into comfortable clothes and sat on my couch staring at my phone. As I tried to fall asleep that night, I told myself what I always did after these encounters. They don't mean to take advantage of me. They're just worried about Jake. I'm more stable financially, so it makes sense they'd ask me for help. Family is supposed to support each other, but a small voice inside me whispered a different truth. This wasn't about family support. This was about enabling Jake's destructive behavior at my expense. And no amount of financial success could fill the void left by parents who consistently treated me like a bank account rather than their daughter. I pushed that voice away and fell into a troubled sleep, unaware that this uncomfortable dinner was just the beginning of a family crisis that would ultimately force me to confront the painful reality of my role in their dysfunction once and for all. 2 weeks after that disastrous family dinner, I woke up to my phone ringing at 6 a.m. I saw my mother's name on the screen and felt immediate dread. Early morning calls from my family were never good news. This wasn't the first time Jake's problems had escalated to emergency status, but this call felt different. Usually my parents would call during normal hours with requests for small loans or temporary help. The urgency of this call was concerning. I answered on the fourth ring, already knowing I wouldn't like what I was about to hear. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Marie, thank God you answered. We need your help immediately. Jake is in serious trouble." I sat up in bed, my heart already racing. "What kind of trouble? Is he hurt?" "He owes money to some very dangerous people and they're threatening him. They came to the house last night looking for him. Your father and I are terrified." This was escalating beyond anything I had imagined. "Mom, how much money does he actually owe? And to whom?" It's not just about the money anymore, she said, her voice shaking. These men said if Jake doesn't pay them by tonight, there will be consequences. They mentioned you specifically, Marie. They know where you work, where you live. Fear shot through me like ice water. They mentioned me? What did they say? They said Jake had told them his sister was a successful doctor who could help with the debt. They seemed to think you were part of some payment plan. I felt sick. Jake told them I would pay his debts. Without asking me first? He was desperate, sweetheart. He didn't know what else to do. These aren't the kind of people you can negotiate with. We need $50,000 by tonight, or... She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. I got out of bed and started pacing my apartment, my mind racing. Mom, I don't have $50,000 in cash. My money is tied up in investments, student loans, and my mortgage. Can't you take out a loan? Use your credit cards? Borrow against your house? The casual way she suggested I destroy my financial stability to fix Jake's mistakes took my breath away. You're asking me to potentially ruin my credit and my financial future to pay for Jake's gambling debts? It's not gambling, she said quickly. It was an investment opportunity that went wrong. And we're not asking you to ruin anything. We're asking you to help your brother when he needs you most. An investment opportunity with dangerous people who make threats and demand payment by midnight? I asked sarcastically. Mom, that's called loan sharking, and Jake is in debt to criminals. Don't be so dramatic, she replied, but I could hear the fear in her voice. Jake made some mistakes, but he's still your brother. Family doesn't abandon family. I sat down heavily on my couch, feeling the familiar weight of family obligation pressing down on me. What happens if I can't get the money by tonight? They said they would start with Jake, but if he can't pay, they'll go after his family members. They specifically mentioned your medical practice, Marie. They said doctors have ways of getting money quickly. The threat was clear and it was terrifying. These people knew where I worked, where I lived, and they saw me as a source of money to collect Jake's debt. Have you called the police? Jake begged us not to. He says that will make things worse. He's already talking about leaving town, starting over somewhere else. So Jake is planning to run away and leave the rest of us to deal with the consequences of his choices. He's scared, Marie. We all are. You're the only one who can fix this. Those words hit me like a physical blow. I was the only one who could fix this. Not Jake, who had created this mess. Not my parents, who had enabled his behavior for years. Me, the responsible one. The successful one. The one who always cleaned up everyone else's mistakes. I looked at my watch. It was 6:30 a.m., and I had to be at the hospital by 8 a.m. for an important case consultation. I had worked for years to build my reputation as a reliable professional pathologist. And now I was being asked to jeopardize everything because of Jake's gambling addiction. I need time to think, I said finally. I'll call you back in a few hours. We don't have a few hours, my mother said urgently. These people want an answer by noon about whether we'll have the money by tonight. I felt trapped. The rational part of my mind knew that paying Jake's debt would only enable more destructive behavior. But the fear in my mother's voice and the very real threat to my safety made it hard to think clearly. I'll see what I can do, I heard myself saying. But Mom, after this, Jake needs professional help. Real help, not just more money. Of course, sweetheart. Once this crisis is over, we'll look into rehab programs and counseling. You're saving our family. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment feeling overwhelmed. I had 45 minutes to get ready for work, but all I could think about was how I had become the family's emergency fund. Every crisis, every poor decision, every consequence of Jake's choices somehow became my responsibility to fix. I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years, claiming a family emergency. Then I spent the morning trying to figure out how to access $50,000 on short notice without destroying my financial stability. As I made phone calls to banks and financial advisors, I kept thinking about the pattern that had led to this moment. Jake's problems had been escalating for years, and my parents had consistently looked to me to provide the solutions. When had I become the family ATM? When had my success become synonymous with my obligation to fix everyone else's failures? By noon, I had managed to arrange a high-interest emergency loan against my house. It would cost me thousands in fees and interest, but I could have the money by evening. As I sat in the bank signing papers that put my home at risk, I realized I wasn't just paying Jake's debt. I was paying for years of family dysfunction, and the price was my own financial security. But even as I signed the papers, I knew this wouldn't be the end. Jake's addiction wouldn't magically disappear because one debt was paid. My parents wouldn't suddenly stop enabling his behavior, and I would still be the first person they called when the next crisis hit. The most painful realization was that this crisis had clarified something I had been avoiding for years. My family valued me for what I could provide, not for who I was. My medical degree wasn't a source of pride for them. It was a resource to be tapped when Jake's poor choices caught up with him. As I left the bank with a cashier's check for $50,000, I felt something inside me breaking. Not just my heart, but the fantasy I had clung to that someday my parents would see me as more than just the solution to Jake's problems. That evening, as I handed over the money that would temporarily solve Jake's crisis while jeopardizing my own financial future, I made a decision. This would be the last time I allowed my family's dysfunction to define my worth and determine my choices. I didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but I knew with absolute certainty that something fundamental had to change. The person who had walked into that bank that morning, desperate to save her family from the consequences of her brother's addiction, was not the same person who walked out. The next morning, I woke up with a crushing headache and the devastating realization that I had potentially jeopardized my financial future for someone who had never shown any intention of changing his destructive behavior. As I got ready for work, I kept replaying the events of the previous day, feeling a mixture of resentment and regret that I had never experienced before. I had barely slept, my mind churning with questions about what I had done and what it meant for my relationship with my family. The $50,000 was gone, transferred to pay off Jake's gambling debts, but I knew this was just a temporary solution that would probably need to be repeated in a few months. I forced myself to go to work, though every part of me wanted to stay in bed and avoid facing the reality of what my family had asked me to do. I had an important autopsy scheduled that morning, and despite my emotional turmoil, my patients deserved my full attention and expertise. As I drove to the hospital, memories of previous financial crises involving Jake flooded my mind. When I was in medical school, Jake had asked for a small loan to cover rent, which turned into several $1,000s over 2 years that was never repaid. When I started my residency, my parents had asked me to co-sign a car loan for Jake, which he defaulted on, damaging my credit score. When I bought my first house, Jake had somehow convinced my parents that I should let him stay in my spare room temporarily while he got back on his feet. That 3-month arrangement turned into 8 months of him using my home as a base for his gambling activities, bringing strangers over at all hours and leaving me feeling unsafe in my own space. Each time I had told myself it was family obligation, that successful family members help struggling relatives, that Jake would eventually learn from his mistakes. But the truth was, my willingness to solve his problems had only enabled more destructive behavior. By the time I reached the hospital, I knew something was very wrong with my body. My chest felt tight, my breathing was labored, and I was experiencing a level of stress-induced physical symptoms I had never felt before. My colleague, Dr. Patterson, took one look at me as I entered the pathology department and immediately expressed concern. "Marie, you look terrible. Are you feeling all right?" Her face showed genuine worry. "Family emergency," I managed to explain between shallow breaths. "Had to deal with a financial crisis. Didn't sleep much." Dr. Patterson frowned. "You need to take care of yourself. You can't help anyone if you collapse from stress." "I'll be fine," I protested weakly. "I have the Henderson autopsy this morning, and the family is expecting results by afternoon." "I can handle the Henderson case," she insisted. "You need to either go home and rest, or at least see someone in the ER about those breathing issues." I wanted to argue, but as I tried to take a deep breath, I realized she was right. The stress of the previous day had triggered some kind of physical response that I couldn't ignore. As a medical professional, I knew the signs of a panic attack, but I had never experienced one myself. I gathered my things and headed toward the hospital's employee health clinic, feeling defeated. As I walked through the corridors I knew so well, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had betrayed myself by giving in to my family's financial demands. When I reached the clinic, I was examined by Dr. Chen, a colleague I had worked with on several cases. After checking my vital signs and listening to my heart, he asked about recent stresses in my life. "I just paid $50,000 to cover my brother's gambling debts," I said, the words sounding surreal even as I spoke them. The people he owed money to had threatened my family, and my parents made it clear that I was the only one who could fix the situation. Dr. Chen looked at me with a mixture of concern and understanding. Marie, that's an enormous stressor. Has this kind of family financial crisis happened before? Yes, I admitted. This is just the biggest one. Jake has gambling and money problems, and somehow they always become my problems to solve. Have you considered that this pattern might not be healthy for any of you, including Jake? His question hit me like a physical blow. Of course I had considered it, but I had never said it out loud to another person. I know it's not healthy, but they're my family. If I don't help, who will? That's not actually your responsibility, he said gently. You're not obligated to destroy your own financial stability to enable someone else's addiction. As he spoke, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not the stress-induced tightness I had been experiencing, but a different kind of pressure. The pressure of years of family expectations, of being the responsible one, of always being the solution to problems I hadn't created. Dr. Chen recommended I take the rest of the day off to decompress and suggested I consider speaking with a counselor about family boundary issues. As I left the clinic, I realized I had never taken a sick day for mental health reasons. I had always pushed through, always met my obligations, always been reliable. But as I drove home, I began to wonder what if my reliability had become a trap? What if my family's expectation that I would always fix their problems had prevented them from learning to fix problems themselves? When I got home, I found several missed calls from my mother and a text from Jake that simply said, "Thanks for saving my life. I owe you big time." The casual tone of Jake's message, as if I had done him a small favor rather than risked my financial security, sparked something in me that felt dangerously close to rage. I had worked for over a decade to build my career and financial stability, and in one day I had potentially jeopardized all of it because of his poor choices. I didn't respond to Jake's text. Instead, I sat on my couch and really thought about what had happened. Not just the immediate crisis, but the years of smaller crises that had led to this moment. The pattern of behavior that had made my family see me as a resource to be tapped rather than a person to be valued. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel angry. Really, truly angry. Not just disappointed or frustrated, but furious that my success had been turned into an obligation to fund my brother's self-destruction. Furious that my parents had pressured me to risk everything I had worked for without considering the cost to me personally. That anger was frightening because I had spent my entire life being the calm, rational, solutions-oriented family member. But it was also liberating because it meant I was finally seeing the situation clearly, without the fog of family obligation and guilt that had clouded my judgment for so many years. As the afternoon turned into evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I would not be available to solve the next crisis. I would not answer emergency phone calls about Jake's problems. I would not risk my financial future again to enable behavior that would never change unless he faced real consequences. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like finally standing up straight after years of carrying a weight that was never mine to carry. My family would not understand, and there would probably be consequences for setting boundaries that had never existed before. But for the first time in my adult life, I was choosing my own well-being over my family's dysfunction. And despite the fear that came with that choice, it also brought a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. That evening, as I sat in my apartment trying to process what had happened over the past 24 hours, I received a call from my father. I almost didn't answer, knowing it would likely be another request related to Jake's situation. But something made me pick up. "Marie, your mother and I want to thank you for what you did yesterday. You really saved our family." His words should have made me feel good, but instead they made me feel hollow. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. How many times has this happened before?" There was a long pause before he responded. "What do you mean? How many times have you and Mum expected me to solve Jake's problems with my money? How many times have I been treated like the family emergency fund?" "That's not fair," he said defensively. "We've never expected anything from you. We've only asked for help when Jake was really in trouble. Dad, yesterday wasn't the first time. There was the car loan I co-signed that ruined my credit, the rent money in medical school, the various business investments that always seemed to require my financial backing. When did helping family become my primary responsibility?" "You're being dramatic," he replied, but I could hear uncertainty in his voice. "Family helps family. When you have more resources, you share them with people who need help." "But it's not reciprocal," I said, feeling my voice get stronger. When have you or Mom or Jake ever helped me with anything significant? When I was struggling through medical school, when I was working 20-hour days as a resident, when I bought my house and needed help moving, where was the family support then? You never asked for help, he said weakly. You always seemed like you had everything under control. Because I learned early that asking for help wasn't really an option in our family. All the help flowed in one direction toward Jake's crises. My successes were taken for granted and my struggles were invisible. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my father alternating between defensiveness and attempts to minimize what had happened. He kept returning to the theme that successful family members have obligations to help struggling relatives, without acknowledging that Jake's struggles were largely self-created and that his help had never resulted in lasting change. When I finally hung up, I felt emotionally drained but also clearer about the family dynamics than I had ever been before. The pattern wasn't just about money. It was about my role as the family problem solver, the responsible one, the person who could always be counted on to sacrifice her own interests for the good of others. But the good of others had never actually been achieved. Jake's problems had only gotten worse over the years, despite my repeated financial interventions. My parents had become increasingly dependent on me as a solution to crises they seemed incapable of addressing themselves. And I had become resentful and exhausted from constantly being in crisis management mode. 3 days after paying Jake's debt, I received a call from him directly. "Hey Marie, I wanted to thank you again for helping me out. I know it was a lot of money. Jake, we need to talk about what happened and what's going to happen going forward." "What do you mean?" he asked, sounding genuinely confused. "I mean, this can't happen again. I risked my house to pay your gambling debts. And I need you to understand that this was not a sustainable solution." "It's not gambling," he said quickly. "It was an investment that went wrong. And I'm going to pay you back as soon as my next business opportunity comes through." The casual dismissal of the seriousness of what had occurred and the immediate mention of another business opportunity made my stomach drop. "Jake, the people you owed money to threatened our entire family. That doesn't happen with legitimate investments. That happens with illegal gambling or loan shark situations." "You're making it sound worse than it was," he replied. "Everything worked out fine. The situation is resolved and now I can focus on rebuilding." "Rebuilding with what money? Using whose resources? Because if you're planning another business venture, I need you to understand that I won't be funding it." There was a long silence before he spoke again. "I can't believe you're being like this." I said I would pay you back. "With what money, Jake? You haven't had a legitimate job in 3 years. Every business idea has failed and cost our family more money. When have you ever actually paid anyone back? That's different. Those were learning experiences." I understand business better now. His complete lack of insight into his own pattern of behavior was both frustrating and heartbreaking. I realized that my repeated financial rescues had actually prevented him from facing the natural consequences of his choices and learning from his mistakes. "I'm not going to be available to solve your next crisis," I said, the words feeling both scary and liberating. "If you get into financial trouble again, you'll need to find another solution." "You can't be serious," he said, anger creeping into his voice. "Family doesn't abandon family. Mom and Dad raised us to look out for each other." "Looking out for each other should be mutual," I replied. "It shouldn't be one person constantly sacrificing their financial security to enable another person's destructive behavior." The conversation ended badly, with Jake accusing me of being selfish and me feeling guilty, but also determined to maintain the boundary I had just set. Over the next several days, I received multiple calls and texts from my parents, alternating between guilt trips about family loyalty and reassurances that Jake was really going to change this time. But I had heard those reassurances before after every crisis, and nothing had ever changed except the size of the financial problems and the level of risk involved. I realized that my willingness to solve Jake's problems had actually become part of the problem itself. For the first time in my adult life, I was refusing to be the family solution. It was terrifying because I didn't know how my relationships would change or what would happen to Jake without my financial safety net. But it was also necessary because the current pattern was unsustainable and ultimately harmful to everyone involved, including me. The family dynamics that had shaped my entire life were about to change dramatically. And while that change felt scary, it also felt like the beginning of something healthier for all of us, even if my family couldn't see it that way yet. 8 months have passed since that day. I wrote a check for $50,000 to pay my brother's gambling debts. 8 months of boundary setting, family conflict, and profound personal growth. I sit here in my home office looking at the financial recovery plan. I've been following, reflecting on how much has changed both around me and within me. The financial impact of Jake's crisis has been significant but manageable. The high-interest loan I took against my house has been my top priority, and I've been making extra payments to minimize the long-term cost. I've had to postpone some personal goals, like the vacation to Italy I had been planning, but my financial foundation remains solid. More importantly, I've learned to see that loan not as a family sacrifice, but as an expensive lesson in boundaries that I needed to learn. The money was painful to lose, but it brought me something invaluable clarity about my family dynamics and my own worth. My relationship with my family has evolved in ways that have been both difficult and necessary. Jake and I barely speak now. He has had 2 more financial crises since I paid his debt, and both times he expected me to provide the solution. When I refused, he accused me of abandoning family and being selfish with my success. The second crisis involved him borrowing money from my parents' retirement account, which they somehow managed to frame as my fault for not being available to help. The third crisis resulted in him moving back home at age 25, unemployed and deeper in debt than ever before. My parents have struggled to understand why I've stepped back from my role as family problem solver. They continue to call me when Jake's situation gets dire, but I've learned to say, "That sounds very difficult. What resources are you planning to use to address it?" instead of automatically offering solutions. This shift has been hard for all of us, but it's also forced Jake to face some consequences for his choices for the first time in his adult life. He's currently in a court-mandated gambling addiction program after being arrested for writing bad checks. And while he's still not taking full responsibility for his actions, at least he's getting professional help. My parents have had to confront the reality that their pattern of enabling Jake's behavior has actually made his problems worse over time. They're attending family counseling sessions, though progress is slow. My mother still occasionally suggests that I'm being too hard on Jake, but she's also starting to see that their previous approach wasn't helping anyone. The most significant change has been in how I see myself and my role in relationships. I'm no longer the family emergency contact, the first person people call when they need financial help, or the one responsible for solving everyone else's problems. Instead, I'm learning to be someone who offers emotional support without automatically offering financial solutions. I've started dating again for the first time in years, having realized that my family dysfunction had made it difficult for me to form healthy romantic relationships. I had been so focused on being the responsible one in my family that I had little energy left for building a partnership with someone who could be an equal contributor to a relationship. My work life has also improved dramatically since I stopped being in constant crisis management mode about family issues. I've been able to focus on a research project that led to a significant publication, and I was recently promoted to head of the pathology department. For the first time, my professional achievements feel like they belong entirely to me, rather than being something that makes me a more valuable resource for family emergencies. I've made new friends through a hiking group for medical professionals, and I've discovered interests and hobbies that I never had time for when I was always managing family crises. I'm learning who I am when I'm not defined by my role as the family savior. The most profound lesson has been about the nature of healthy family relationships. Love shouldn't feel like a financial transaction. Support shouldn't flow in only one direction. Being successful shouldn't automatically make you responsible for other people's poor choices. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require me to continue participating in dysfunctional patterns. I can love my family while also protecting myself from their attempts to make their problems my emergencies. Perhaps the most unexpected development has been a gradual improvement in my relationship with Jake. Without the dynamic of me constantly rescuing him, we've actually started to have more honest conversations about his addiction and its impact on our family. He's still not ready to take full responsibility for his choices, but he's also stopped expecting me to fix everything for him. The boundary I set 8 months ago, when I decided I would no longer be available to solve Jake's financial crises, has held firm. There have been tests, guilt trips, family pressure, and moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. But each time I've maintained that boundary, I've gotten stronger and more confident in my decision. My family still doesn't fully understand why I changed the rules of our relationship so dramatically. They see it as me becoming selfish or hard-hearted. But I know it's actually the opposite. I'm finally caring for myself the way I had always cared for them. The check I wrote for $50,000 was the last payment I'll ever make towards someone else's self-created crisis. It was expensive, but it bought me my freedom from a family dynamic that was slowly destroying my financial security and emotional well-being. If you're watching this and recognize yourself in my story, if you're the family ATM, the one who always solves everyone else's problems, the person whose success has become everyone else's safety net, please know that you deserve better. Your achievements are yours to enjoy, not resources for other people to access when their poor choices catch up with them. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for people is to stop enabling their destructive behavior, even when they interpret that as abandonment. Sometimes setting boundaries feels cruel in the short term, but creates the possibility for healthier relationships in the long term. The most important thing I've learned is that my worth isn't determined by my willingness to sacrifice my well-being for others. I don't have to earn love by being the family problem solver. I can be valued for who I am, not just for what I can provide. Breaking free from the role of family savior has been one of the hardest things I've ever done, but also one of the most necessary. For the first time in my adult life, I'm living for myself, not as a resource for other people's crises. And that feels like the most valuable investment I've ever made.